The year was 1868. America was still bleeding from the wounds of the Civil War. The battlefields lay silent, but the scars of division ran deep across the country. Families had been torn apart. Fathers never returned home. Brothers who once shared the same blood had turned their guns against each other. And in the aftermath of this devastation, the Western Territories became both a haven and a nightmare, a place where men and women came seeking a new beginning, but often found themselves faced with hardship, lawlessness, and moral compromises that would haunt them for generations. California in those days was nothing like the land of opportunity it is imagined to be today. It was rugged, unforgiving, and uncertain. Beyond the gold rush that had briefly lit up the land 2 decades earlier, there remained poverty, hunger, and desperation. Farms were hard to sustain, crops failed often, droughts left families thirsty and livestock dying, and in this world, survival wasn't guaranteed. It is here that we meet Thomas Hale, a man of 28 years. He was not extraordinary, not wealthy, not powerful, just a young farmer trying to carve a life from stubborn soil. His parents had died during a fever outbreak, leaving him with nothing but a small piece of land and the burden of survival. But perhaps Thomas's heaviest inheritance wasn't land at all. It was loneliness and the need to make choices in a world where morality often had to bend to survival. After the war, when widows and orphans became as common as dust, Thomas's widowed Aunt Margaret came to live with him. She was 10 years older than him, her husband killed in the war, her possessions taken by creditors. With no children of her own, she sought refuge with the only relative who had space for her. In the eyes of the law, there was nothing unusual about a nephew taking in his aunt. But in the eyes of society, even in those rugged western towns, every action was weighed by suspicion, every relationship measured by rumor. 2 adults alone, living under one roof, were bound to raise questions. People in 1868 understood something we often forget today. Your reputation could mean life or death. In an age without government aid, without hospitals, without legal protections, your survival often depended on your community. You needed neighbors to trade food, merchants to extend credit, farmers to lend tools. If your reputation soured, your livelihood crumbled, and so whispers began to spread in Thomas's small town. People saw the young man and his older aunt in the marketplace together, building a life on that lonely farm. Some judged them kindly, a good boy taking care of his family. Others whispered darker suspicions. Human beings have always been quick to gossip, and in a land where entertainment was scarce, scandal was a pastime. At first, Thomas ignored the murmurs. After all, what did it matter? He was working the land, feeding his animals, trying to survive. But gossip in small towns is like wildfire. It spreads quickly, and it destroys even the strongest homes. The turning point came when one of Thomas's neighbors, a bitter man who had once sought to buy his farm, openly mocked him. "You play husband to your own aunt, boy. No wonder the good Lord sent drought to your land." The laughter that followed cut deep. Thomas realized then that ignoring the whispers was no longer enough. If people did not respect his household, they would not trade with him. Without trade, there would be no supplies. Without supplies, there would be no survival. And so, in a decision that would forever taint his family name, Thomas asked Margaret to marry him. It was not a proposal of passion. It was a bargain of necessity. In the Wild West, where law barely existed, there was only one way to silence gossip, to legitimize it. If people question their closeness, then let them call it marriage. To us today, the decision seems shocking, even revolting. But to Thomas in that moment, it seemed logical. Hunger dulls morality. Desperation silences conscience. When you are cornered between starvation and survival, you may choose actions that history will condemn. But in the moment, those actions feel like the only path forward. Thomas convinced himself it was temporary, that people would stop whispering, that the town would accept him again, that one day when things were better, he could leave the shadows of this choice behind. Margaret, broken by grief and weariness, agreed. For her, it wasn't romance either. It was protection. It was the chance to be safe in a world where widows were preyed upon, mocked, and abandoned. Their wedding was small, quiet, held by a local preacher who asked no questions. The few neighbors who attended muttered among themselves but said nothing aloud. On paper, Thomas Hale was no longer a man living with his aunt. He was a married man running a household, building a life. The whispers quieted for a time, but the land itself seemed to mirror the truth. Seasons turned harsher, the soil yielded little, livestock died suddenly. Some said it was just the cycle of nature. Others said it was judgment, and Thomas began to wonder if marrying Margaret had cursed his farm, or if it was simply the price of survival. This was the essence of California in 1868. A place where morality often bent beneath the weight of necessity. Families made choices not because they were noble, but because they were desperate. Survival demanded sacrifices, and sometimes those sacrifices turned into sins. This keynote of Thomas Hale's life teaches us something timeless. When survival becomes the only goal, morality often loses its place. But choices made in desperation leave scars that time cannot erase. In marrying his aunt, Thomas believed he was silencing gossip and securing survival. In truth, he was planting the seeds of a much darker story, one that would grow beyond his control. A story that would pass from him to Margaret's daughter and into the future generations of the Hale family. Survival saved his body, but it wounded his soul, and in 1868 California, that was the price too many were willing to pay. In 1868 California, there was a harshness to life that could shape people as much as the rocky soil and the relentless sun. Men and women carved their survival out of uncertainty, but in small towns and valleys, there was always one element more unforgiving than the land itself: the whispers of people. Gossip in those days was not just idle talk, it was a force. It could uplift, but more often it destroyed. Families did not crumble under the weight of earthquakes or storms as often as they did under the unrelenting pressure of rumors. And in the case of the man who married his aunt and then her daughter, the whispers followed him like a shadow that would not loosen its grip. The townsfolk did not speak openly at first. In communities where everyone relied on one another for survival, help with farming, loans of seed, shared water rights, there was a silent agreement not to rock the boat too loudly. But silence was never permanent. Behind closed doors, voices trembled with shock, disgust, or fascination. "Did you hear?" They'd murmur to one another in kitchens and barns. "He didn't just marry his aunt, he married her daughter too." It was the kind of secret that could not remain contained. People's hearts often cling to scandal as though other people's darkness makes their own burdens lighter. Soon, every glance at the man's family carried judgment. Neighbors stopped visiting. Children, taught by hushed tones at home, laughed at his offspring in the schoolyard. Even church, the supposed place of refuge, became an echo chamber of sideways glances and condemning sermons about sin in the camp. But what is more dangerous than whispers is the way people carry them inside. The man himself began to feel the coldness creep in, not just from his community but from within his own home. The aunt turned. Wife lived in a strange half-life, torn between the role of mother and the role of spouse, shamed by what people thought but bound by what survival had forced upon her. Her daughter, later made wife as well, walked under an even heavier weight. For her, there was no clear place in the world. She was at once a daughter, a niece, and a wife, but in truth, she was none of these things fully. And in her silence, she bore the cruelest whispers of all, the ones she told herself. The children who came from these unions bore no fault of their own, but innocence did not shield them. They were whispered about before they could even understand why. Other children's parents told them not to play with those kids, as though guilt could be inherited like eye color. In this way, the sins of adults became a chain around the necks of the innocent, dragging them down into isolation. The weight of whispers in a small town is not just about being talked about. It is about being erased from the life of the community, erased from the warmth of belonging, erased from the chance to simply be normal. Whispers rob people of their humanity long before they rob them of anything else. And in that California valley, this family learned that the world may forgive hunger, forgive theft, forgive even violence when desperate, but it rarely forgives scandal. Yet within this suffocating darkness, there was also a lesson, a hard one, but a real one. Whispers cannot dictate who you truly are unless you allow them to. The man's children, as they grew, had two choices: to live under the shadow of their parents' decisions or to rise beyond them. Some of them broke free, choosing to leave that valley, to change their names, to build lives elsewhere. They understood that identity is not just inherited, it can also be rebuilt. Others, however, could not bear the burden. They lived quietly, heads bowed, as though apologizing for a past they never authored. The truth of the matter is this: secrets rot the soul, but whispers rot the world around it. They spread like fire in dry grass, destroying not only the people at the center, but everyone standing too close. Families fracture, friends pull away, and entire legacies are rewritten by half-truths and exaggerations. The people of that valley may not have understood compassion, but they understood entertainment. And to them the family was not human, it was a story, something to tell, something to point at, something to judge so they could feel cleaner themselves. If there is a motivation in this darkness, it is this: you cannot control what people whisper, but you can control how much power you give those whispers. The man, for all his sins or survival choices, remained standing. His wives, for all their confusion and shame, kept moving forward, and his children, though scarred by words sharper than knives, eventually came to learn one of life's hardest lessons: your worth is not determined by other people's tongues. In the end, whispers may linger, but so does strength, and strength, unlike gossip, builds legacies that last. Children have a way of seeing things that adults try to hide. They may not have the words, but their eyes catch every glance, every silence, every contradiction. In the shadowed household of 1868 California, where a man had bound himself not only to his aunt but later to her daughter, there was one figure who stood at the center of it all: the daughter. She was young but not blind, and as she grew, so too did her awareness of the web she was caught in. At first, the house seemed like any other to an outsider: a roof patched together with wood and tar, a hearth where meals were prepared, and laughter that sometimes tried to mask the tension beneath. But the daughter felt it differently. She was old enough to remember her mother before she became her father's wife. She knew the lines of her face when she smiled as a mother, and she noticed how they shifted into something else when she was expected to act as a spouse. Children may not understand words like betrayal, sin, or scandal, but they understand when something feels wrong. Her questions began early. "Mama, why does Auntie sleep in the same room as Papa? Mama, why do people stop talking when I walk into the room?" At first, her mother hushed her. Then, as the girl grew, those questions turned into silence. She stopped asking aloud, but inside, she began stitching together her own answers. That silence was its own kind of prison, the prison of knowing too much but being too young to hold it. The burden of knowledge is heavier when you cannot share it. In a small town, secrets are like smoke. They cling to everything, even if you pretend they don't exist. At school, children whispered. She didn't know all the details, but she caught the way other girls looked at her, the way boys laughed when she passed, the way their parents tugged them away as though her presence alone carried shame. She understood, even without words, that she was living under a shadow that had nothing to do with her choices. But what made her burden unbearable was that she carried two truths at once. On one hand, she loved her family, her mother, her step-mother, aunt, and even her father, though he was the source of the whispers. She loved the moments when they laughed, when the world outside didn't matter, when she felt the simple warmth of belonging. But on the other hand, she knew those moments were fragile illusions. Behind every smile was a fracture. Behind every touch was something unspoken, something heavy that no child should have to name. As she grew older, that awareness turned into anger. Why had her parents put her in this position? Why had they chosen survival over morality, knowing the world would judge them? Why had her own mother allowed herself to be folded into something so unnatural? These weren't questions she asked aloud, but they burned inside her. Anger is often born when a child is forced to carry an adult's burden, and she was carrying the heaviest one of all. She knew too much to be innocent, yet she was too young to truly understand. Her breaking point came the day she overheard the preacher. She had slipped into the back of the church while sweeping floors, and she heard his voice thunder against unholy unions, abominations against God. Though he didn't say her family's name, everyone knew who he meant. She felt every pair of eyes in the congregation turn toward her, though she was hidden in the shadows. That moment carved something deep into her soul, the realization that her family would never be free of whispers, that even the church, the one place where grace was supposed to live, had become another judge's gavel. But here is where her story turns into something more. She could have been crushed under that knowledge. She could have let the whispers define her, let the shame her parents carried become her own. Instead, she chose differently. She decided that knowing too much was not only a burden, it could also be a weapon. She understood early that secrets ruin people when they let them fester in silence, but when you bring them into the light, when you confront them, they lose their power. As a young woman, she began to speak boldly, not recklessly, but truthfully. When townsfolk whispered about her family, she would look them in the eye instead of lowering her head. When children mocked her, she confronted them with words sharper than theirs. And within her own home, she forced conversations that her parents tried to bury. She was the one who said, "This isn't right, we need to face it." Though her parents resisted, the very act of speaking truth shifted something. It wasn't easy. Her words caused conflict, tears, even rifts in the family, but they also planted seeds of healing. For the first time, they stopped pretending. And in that painful honesty, there was the beginning of something new, not a happy ending, but a chance to grow beyond the shadows. Her lesson was this: knowing too much can break you, but it can also make you wise. Secrets are heavy, yes, but they are also teachers. They teach you who you are when the world points its finger. They teach you whether you will let shame silence you or courage define you. The daughter who knew too much did not escape her pain, but she refused to let it cage her. She turned knowledge into strength, shame into defiance, and whispers into fuel for truth. And so her story reminds us all, the things we know, even the things that wound us, do not have to destroy us. They can refine us, they can make us unbreakable. Every family hopes to leave behind a legacy. Some dream of wealth, others of land, others of a name carried with pride through generations. In 19th century California, where survival was often brutal and fortunes fragile, a man's legacy was considered his only immortality. But what happens when the choices of one generation rot the very foundation on which a legacy is built? What happens when the inheritance left behind is not land or gold, but shame and whispers? That is the weight of a collapsed legacy. In 1868, the man who bound himself first to his aunt and later to her daughter may have thought he was preserving his bloodline. He may have believed he was ensuring continuity, that the family name, twisted as it was, would endure. But a legacy is not measured by survival alone. A legacy is measured by honor, by integrity, by the strength of character passed from parent to child. And when that foundation is cracked, the collapse is inevitable. At first, the collapse was subtle. Families rarely fall all at once. They erode in silence, in shadows, in whispers passed down like poison. His children bore his name, but not his pride. They carried with them not only his blood, but also the suspicion of their neighbors. Wherever they went, eyes followed, doors shut, opportunities withered. They weren't seen as innocent children. They were seen as branches of a tree that had grown twisted. That perception, whether fair or not, was a legacy in itself, a curse disguised as an inheritance. For the man, legacy may have seemed like something material. Land worked by tired hands, a roof built by timber hauled across miles, perhaps a small inheritance of coin. But these things crumble when the name attached to them is stained. What good is land if no one will trade with you? What good is a home if neighbors treat you like a pariah? What good is money if the town preacher uses your family as an example of sin made flesh? Legacy is not only about what you leave, it is about how it endures. His inevitably was rotting from the inside out. The collapse showed itself in the children most of all, for they carried the heaviest burden, the conflict between loving the man who gave them life and resenting the man who ruined their future. Some grew quiet, folding into themselves, ashamed of their own blood. Others rebelled, throwing the shame back at the world, living recklessly as if to say, "If you will not respect me, then fear me." That is the cruelty of a broken legacy. It bends the children until they no longer know if they are victims or participants in the shame. The daughter, who already carried the weight of knowing too much, bore witness to this collapse daily. She saw how neighbors avoided their family's market stall. She saw the way schoolmasters treated her brothers differently, as though their very presence was a disruption. She saw how the family's name, once spoken with neutrality, had become a byword for disgrace. And she understood, before she was even grown, that her inheritance was not gold or land, but a burden she would spend her life trying to escape. This is the true tragedy of a collapsed legacy. It does not end with the sinner. It spreads like wildfire, consuming the innocent. A man's choices ripple outward until they touch children yet unborn. A family's legacy can either bless generations or curse them. And in this family's case, it became a curse, a story whispered long after the man was gone, a scar that did not heal with time. But collapse also has a strange power. When something falls apart so completely, it leaves room for rebuilding. The daughter, in her strength, understood this. She knew she could not erase her father's sins. She could not rewrite the whispers that followed her family. But she also knew that collapse was not the end. It was an opportunity to start again, to build something new, not on the rotten foundations of secrecy and forbidden choices, but on truth, courage, and resilience. That is the paradox of legacy. While it may be inherited, it is not inescapable. Collapse destroys the illusion of permanence, but it also clears the ground for something different. And so, the daughter, scarred by whispers but strengthened by them too, became the seed of a new kind of legacy, not defined by shame, but by the refusal to bow to it. What the man failed to understand, and what history reminds us, is that legacy is not preserved by clinging to bloodlines or by forcing continuity at all costs. It is preserved by righteousness, by dignity, by choices that may not always guarantee wealth, but will guarantee respect. His collapse was not inevitable because of poverty or hardship. It was inevitable because he traded morality for survival, and in that trade, he sacrificed the one thing that gives legacy power: honor. The story of this collapsed legacy echoes beyond one family. It is a warning to every generation. What you do in the shadows may seem private, but it seeps into the bones of your children. The choices you make for survival may feed you for a day, but they shape the lives of those who come after you. You may pass down land, you may pass down a name, but if you pass down shame, then all of it will crumble. So, the collapse of this man's legacy was not just his ruin, it was his family's inheritance of pain. But within that collapse came a lesson. That legacy is not built on desperate choices, but on steadfast ones. That survival without integrity is not survival at all, but a slow death stretched across generations, and that every parent must ask themselves, what am I leaving behind, not in my hands, but in their hearts? Because in the end, land will erode, homes will rot, names will fade, but the spirit you pass on will endure, and if it is corrupted, it will collapse. If it is strong, it will rise. Darkness has always been a teacher. Not the gentle kind that guides with light and comfort, but the kind that strips you bare, that forces you to see truths you would rather avoid. In the story of this family, where secrecy and forbidden choices entangled like roots of a poisoned tree, the darkness was suffocating. Yet hidden within it were lessons, bitter, painful, and unforgettable. The first lesson is that truth cannot stay buried forever. For years, the man believed he could hide his decisions, conceal his forbidden bonds, and mask his legacy under silence. But darkness does not hold secrets kindly, it festers them. The daughter, growing up under that heavy shroud, saw what others were too blind, or too afraid, to see. She realized that no matter how deep you bury the truth, it always finds a way back to the surface. Sometimes through whispers, sometimes through the broken eyes of children, sometimes through the silence that hangs so heavy that even outsiders feel it. Darkness teaches that secrets are like seeds. They grow whether you want them to or not. The second lesson is that silence can destroy faster than words. The family lived with unspoken truths, each member knowing just enough to feel the weight of shame, but too little to release it. No one dared name what had happened. No one dared challenge the patriarch openly. And so, the silence thickened, turning the house into a tomb. The children felt it in every glance across the dinner table, every pause in a neighbor's conversation, every cold Sunday morning in church when no one sat beside them. Silence was supposed to protect the family, but instead it became the chain that bound them to disgrace. Darkness teaches that silence is not neutral, it is corrosive. The third lesson is that innocence is never truly protected by lies. The father might have thought that by controlling the narrative, he could preserve his children's futures, but children are not blind. They notice the tone in a mother's voice, the absence in a father's eyes, the way neighbors look at them. The daughter especially saw through the facade. She carried questions too large for her age and answers that came not from explanations, but from intuition. Her innocence was stripped not by what was said, but by what was hidden. Darkness teaches that pretending protects no one. It only deepens the wound. The fourth lesson is that shame does not stay within four walls. The family may have tried to hide their truth inside their home, but darkness spills outward. In town, their name carried an echo. In business, their exchanges felt strained. In the schoolyard, their children bore the brunt of cruelty that came without explanation. Shame travels through gossip, through suspicion, through the strange power of collective judgment. It taints every handshake, every partnership, every opportunity. Darkness teaches that private sins often have public consequences. The fifth lesson is that resilience is born from despair. While the father's choices pulled the family into disgrace, the daughter learned to survive it. She carried the whispers like stones in her pocket, heavy, unrelenting, but she also carried a quiet strength. She learned to see people as they truly were, to distinguish between those who condemned without knowing and those who chose compassion. She learned to hold herself upright when others tried to push her down. That resilience did not come from light. It came from walking through shadows so deep she had to create her own strength to endure. Darkness teaches that survival is not born in ease, but in struggle. The sixth and perhaps greatest lesson buried in this darkness is that legacy is shaped not only by what you inherit, but by how you choose to respond. The daughter could not erase her father's decisions. She could not silence the rumors, but she could decide what she would do with the pain. Would she repeat the cycle? Would she bow to despair? Or would she carve something new out of the ruins? In time, she chose the latter. She understood that even a collapsed legacy can become the foundation for a stronger one, if you refuse to let the darkness define you. Darkness teaches that while pain is inherited, so is the power to break free. What then is the final lesson this story whispers to us from 1868? It is this: darkness is not only a place of ruin, it is also a place of revelation. In the absence of light, you learn what is truly inside you. You learn which truths you fear and which ones you must face. You learn who you are when no one else is watching. This family's tragedy, with all its disgrace, is a reminder that darkness always carries lessons for those willing to face it. For us, the lesson is clear. We cannot outrun truth. We cannot silence shame with secrecy. We cannot protect innocence by building walls of lies, but we can survive, we can endure, and we can take the darkness meant to destroy us and use it as a forge for strength. So when you think of this family, of the man who sought to preserve his name by destroying it, of the children who bore his choices, of the daughter who knew too much, remember this: their story is not only about sin and collapse. It is about the lessons buried in darkness, the truths that cannot be hidden, the silence that cannot protect, and the resilience that rises from despair. Because in every family, in every generation, there are shadows. But shadows cannot exist without light, and those who walk through the darkness, carrying its lessons, emerge not unbroken, but unbreakable. History is not only a collection of dates and events, it is a mirror. It reflects human choices, human weaknesses, and the long shadows cast by silence. When we look at the story of the man who married both his aunt and her daughter, it is tempting to push it aside as a grotesque tale of another time, something too twisted to resemble our modern lives. But if we look closely, beneath the scandal and the secrecy, there are lessons that reach into the present. Lessons that remind us that darkness, when ignored, repeats itself. Lessons that demand we not only remember, but also learn. The first lesson is that morality cannot be bent without breaking. In this story, the man justified his choices under the guise of survival, perhaps under the weight of isolation, or even the hunger for control. He thought he could twist the boundaries of family, reshape love into something convenient, and bury the consequences in silence. But morality is not clay, it is glass. Once cracked, it cannot hold its shape. His decision shattered trust, corrupted innocence, and poisoned the very roots of his family tree. What we must learn is that when we compromise what is right for what is easy, the fracture never remains hidden. It spreads, it consumes. The second lesson is that silence is never protection. The family lived under a veil of secrecy, believing that if they spoke nothing, if they pretended long enough, the whispers would fade. But silence only amplifies what it tries to conceal. It creates an echo chamber where shame grows louder, not softer. Neighbors noticed, children noticed, even strangers who passed through the town could sense the tension, the way the family's presence unsettled the air. Silence is not a shield, it is a noose. What we must learn is that speaking truth, even when it is painful, is the only way to prevent shame from multiplying. The third lesson is that children are the truest mirrors of the choices adults make. The daughter grew up surrounded by confusion and contradiction. She carried questions she could not voice and answers she should never have had to know. Her childhood was stolen, not because of what she did, but because of what she witnessed. Innocence cannot survive in an environment built on lies. When parents believe they can protect their children by withholding truth, they forget that children feel long before they understand. They carry the unspoken, the unsaid, and it shapes their souls. What we must learn is that children are not blind. They inherit not only our name but also our unspoken burdens. The fourth lesson is that communities are complicit when they choose whispers over action. The neighbors knew, they gossiped, they speculated, but they stopped short of confrontation. In some ways, they too chose silence, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of the belief that it was not their business. But by refusing to confront the wrongdoing, they became part of the legacy of shame. Evil thrives not just because of those who commit it, but also because of those who watch and do nothing. What we must learn is that collective silence allows corruption to spread beyond one family into an entire community. The fifth lesson is that legacy is fragile. A man may build wealth, land, and power, but if the foundation of his home is rot, all of it collapses. The patriarch of this story likely believed he was securing his lineage by keeping control within bloodlines. Instead, he destroyed the very thing he thought he was preserving. His name became a curse, his descendants bore the weight of his decisions, and the land he toiled for became stained by scandal. What we must learn is that true legacy is not built by inheritance of property, but by inheritance of honor. The sixth lesson is that resilience grows in the darkest soil. The daughter who saw too much, the children who bore the whispers, were not entirely consumed. Broken, yes, scarred, certainly, but in their survival lies a testament to human strength. They learned endurance not because of the light, but because of the shadows they were forced to navigate. Out of their pain came awareness. Out of their shame came defiance. They carried the reminder that even when a family's roots are poisoned, an individual can still choose to grow in another direction. What we must learn is that resilience is not given, it is forged in struggle. The final lesson is this: darkness is a teacher, but only if we are willing to listen. We can look at this story and dismiss it as grotesque history, or we can lean into the discomfort it stirs within us. It tells us to examine our own silences. What do we refuse to confront in our families, our communities, our societies? It asks us to reflect on the legacies we are building, not only the wealth or property we leave behind, but the moral fiber, the honesty, the compassion that shapes the next generation. It reminds us that secrets left to rot always rise to the surface. What we must learn from this story is that human weakness, when left unchecked, always spreads, that shame cannot be buried under silence, that children deserve truth, not confusion, that communities carry responsibility, not just individuals. That legacy is not about power, but about integrity, and that even in the darkest places, the possibility of resilience remains. When we strip away the scandal, the whispers, and the brokenness of 1868 California, what remains is a mirror. A warning, a call. We must not repeat what has already been written in blood and silence. We must be the ones to speak where others stayed quiet. We must be the ones to protect innocence where others corrupted it. We must be the ones to build legacies not of shame, but of honor, because if we do not learn, history will teach us again, and the next time the darkness may not be theirs, it may be ours.